Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to TEFAF Afternoons, a new feature of the cultural programming of TEFAF New York. We're so delighted to have you here. We also have coffee. I have to put in a little plug for coffee talks in the morning on Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday, and one more TEFAF afternoon on Monday afternoon. But you're here for this fantastic program, I can guarantee it, of conversation with Paola Prestini, and Karen Wong has graciously accepted the very easy duty, I'm sure, of drawing Paola out on all the wonderful work that she's doing. Karen is the Deputy Director of the new museum, and I will just leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Linda. I was probably chosen because I've gone through the arc of first being a fan of Paola's, then a colleague, and now a friend. So this is a delight for me to be here with you in conversation. Paola is a Juilliard-trained composer in modern composition and the co-founder and artistic director of National Sawdust. But I wanted to tackle the first thing, which is you as an artist. We had talked earlier that it's modern composition, but of course, growing up, I took classical piano, and then friends told me, oh, it's now going to be new classical, and then I tried a bit of jazz, and then, it was modern, and now it's contemporary. So kind of walk us through these genres of music that you're involved in.
It's a great question. So, the idea of genre right now, I feel, in contemporary composition is really just slipping away. And in fact, if you really think about genre in general, it was really not created by the musician. It was created by the person trying to sell the music. So we have to categorize this in order for somebody to understand if they're going to like it or not. The composer or the musician actually creating that music isn't really thinking about that. They're drawing from a canon of things that have inspired them and then filtering it through their personality and their set of principles to create the abstract form of modern composition. So, when people ask me what my music sounds like, it's, trying to kind of think of ways that I can describe it that will help them understand or hopefully entice them to listen and then make up their own opinion.
So it's quite interesting because there's a seamlessness to how you're positioning music, and given that we are at an art fair, it makes me think that in some cases, in the art world, we're still very interested in painting, sculpture, video, and of course, I think a number of artists are now trying to combine everything and make things more theatrical, which is certainly happening in your field as well. This idea of immersive experience. And it's hard not to also kind of relate it to some current events. So I'm thinking of Jeff Koons' Balloon Dog in Paris for Jay-Z, or you're thinking about the floating stage for Kanye. And on the one hand, spectacular, gorgeous set design, but very much in the proposition of eye candy. And the way you've worked with the idea of theater is just so much integral to a creative process, so much more innovative and authentic. And I'd love to have you take us through maybe the piece that I think you said you actually prototyped here in this building. Okay.
So just backing up into this question, when I was at Juilliard, I wasn't very popular while I was there because I wasn't just happy to be studying composition. I was so intrigued by the other disciplines there, and I was desperate to collaborate with them. And while on one hand I was, very happy to be getting these chops and being, refining the skills that it takes to survive as a composer, I was also desperately aware of what it would take, or at least afraid of what it would take to build a career as a woman composer. And so while I was there, I actually began a company. And it's very interesting because a lot of composers now, or musicians or artists, ask me, when should I take risks? And I'm thinking, oh my God, you should take risks all the time. But especially now, that you're young and that you're in school. And for me, I really think that I treated Juilliard as if it was this kind of extremely fruitful umbrella under which I could experiment and try all things, and that I could fail, and that it would be a safe place. I don't know necessarily that it was a safe place, but in my mind, I was going to do it. So fast forward, I really spent the 10 years after school workshopping interdisciplinary work in every single basement church in the city. In fact, I was very excited to learn that I had been given this theater on Monday nights at 11, and that all I had to do was give them the ticket sales, not understanding that that was, a dark night and that nobody would come and that it really wasn't a big gift. But yes, I was in residence here at the Armory for a year. It was one of the best years of my life, and it was much later because it took, I think a lot of people have the myth that if you go to Juilliard, you're just going to make it. I was not a shooting star. It took me 20 years to build the career I have, and I'm actually very happy that it took me that long because now I know how to sustain a career. But once I got to the Armory, it felt very much like I'd been given this extraordinary pedestal upon which that I could, create the kind of real vision that I'd had in my brain for a long time, and I developed a work called Aging Magician. Not in this room, but in the Board of Officers. Should I show a photo? Okay. So this is, we workshopped it, and part of the thing about when you commission your own work, which I do, still commission a lot of my own work, is that you have to keep showing presenters the work in progress in order for them to pick it up and then finally develop the work. And so this was a workshop with Rindy Eckert, who is a brilliant multidisciplinary artist. He is a singer, he was a Pulitzer Prize finalist for writing, he's also a composer, and Julian Crouch, who is one of the most extraordinary puppeteers and theater directors. He actually founded Improbable Theater Company in London, and then went on to co-direct Satyagraha at the Metropolitan Opera. He's a beautiful designer. So this piece is completely it's completely original. It was based, I wanted to redo the tale of Charon crossing the River Styx, but instead of crossing the River Styx, our clockmaker would actually cross the East River. And his afterlife was an imagined afterlife, and it was Coney Island. But he takes all these, he takes the train, and the train stops at all these stops, and each time you stop at a stop, you get a little bit more about his life. And the children are the Charons. They're the narrators. So he never makes it to Coney Island. He dies before, but this is what it looks like when he gets there. And that's an instrument that we prototyped up at Mass MoCA. It's made from junk and from clock pieces and wheels, and the idea was that all these parts of his imagination would congeal to form a Coney Island of his dreams. And so that last piece is completely put together with improvisation and music and singing and staging. And this was eventually brought to the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, to Arizona State University, to Mass MoCA, to the Krannert Center, and finally on Broadway at the New Victory Theater.
There's a lot of people on stage. Talk a little bit about that, because I know you often work with the Brooklyn Youth Chorus, and why do you like to work with young people? Because they can mess up.
This choir, that's a great point. First of all, this choir rehearses every week, and they are so professional. For them, it's, training through modern composition, which if, you think about it, that's amazing that young people are actually being trained through the music of their time. So to be honest, that's a huge inspiration. And then what was really great in a way about this piece is it took 5 years to pick up. So the kids were 12 when I started with them, and they were 17 by the time they got to Broadway. And they were not the kids that I had imagined in my head, but there was no way I was going to say to them, you're too old. You're not my kids anymore. Like, you're my kids. You just have to wear costumes that make you look younger. But it was, it was amazing, and we learned a lot together.
And I mean, doing something like this, just again, to try to demystify this creative process, which takes as long to make buildings. I mean, oftentimes architecture is also one of these long, drawn out. I mean, 5 years. Many dozens of collaborators. What is that like, and what is your role as the composer of the music versus maybe somebody who you brought in to come and produce, someone who's come in to direct, someone who's doing the lighting, the set design? What is your role in all of that?
So I am both a composer and a producer. So I do raise a lot of the funds for the pieces that I do. The irony is I always thought I cannot wait till I get commissioned by a big company because then I don't have to do all the hard and heavy lifting. And this year I was finally commissioned by this big company and I didn't choose any of my collaborators. Luckily, I loved them, but it was a really interesting lesson that, in fact, all this work that I had been doing for 20 years wasn't really preparing me for something that I didn't have already. It was, in fact, the answer that I had been looking to all along, and that it's amazing when someone actually pays you to do the work, and I'm blessed and I hope I get more, but that, in fact, I always have the work that I want to do and the collaborators I want to work with and the risks I want to take sometimes don't fit into a box that is easily commissionable. So, did I answer the question? No, not at all.
You started to, so that's as a producer.
Oh, so what do I do?
But given that
Sorry.
it's your music, but I'm just so interested. So, how do the other characters? Does everyone have to essentially like go by what you say?
No.
You're the
No. I mean, so basically, I put together the team, and that's a really exciting part for me because it's like assembling a cast of characters. When you work with someone for 5 years, they become your family. They become your family after the experience, but you're building for 5 years a work together. You're frustrated by each other. You have great moments of, happiness. So that's my role, is really at that principle, bringing the people together. And then, like in this piece, we really worked, the three of us, Julian, Rindy, and myself, as principal co-creators to pass by the script. So, for example, this is a funny process because typically as a composer you're given a libretto and then you take those words and you have a couple of months to write the music. But like the character in the book, in the opera, Rindy had writer's block. And so he wasn't giving me text. And so we came 2 weeks before we had all these presenters coming, and he came in and he plopped down this book and he said, "I got it." And I opened it. I was like, "Great, Rindy." And I opened it, and there were all these drawings. And I was like, "Rindy, these aren't words. What am I going to do with this?" And he said, "You know what? Just write dummy words, and then I'll come in and I'll write it into the music." And it was really great because that's actually what ended up working. But these are kinds of very different collaborations that force you to be flexible and to think through the lens of other people. And for me, the reason I got interested in theatrical and interdisciplinary work was because the same way I learned through other composers, I wanted to understand the process of other interdisciplinary artists and how I might learn for the rest of my life.
One of the exciting things, obviously, in your position and now having a career of 20 years is whom you can collaborate with. And when you think of the great set designers in the last 50 years, you probably first have to start off with Josef Zabado, who is Czech, and in the 50s and 60s probably did some of the most imaginative and stunning set designs, mainly doing a lot with lighting and shadow and image making. And then you jump to the present, and you have the English designer Ez Devlin, who started in Shakespeare, but subsequently has quote unquote graduated to the multi-million-dollar set designs of Beyonce and Adele. Sandwiched in between those two, one must say the legacy of Bob Wilson. He's legendary, controversial. I'm sure we've all seen, at least one or two of his works. And I had the immense pleasure of getting to go to Watermill, where you are right now in development of an opera with Bob. So maybe take us through what that experience has been like.
Sure. This is a piece that I've been trying to get off of its feet for 5 years as well. And it's called Old Man in the Sea. It's a piece that I have been wanting to do forever, and I wanted to do it with Bob. And so I had been introduced to him about 10 years ago, and through a common friend who was also a donor, who had commissioned, was one of the commissioners of Einstein on the Beach. And before this friend in common passed away, he said, "I hope that one day you work with Bob." So this is a work that I had in my head, dedicated to Mickey, and I went to Bob and I said, would you please just do this with me? And he looked at the treatment and the ideas, and he said, yes, come up to Watermill. We'll spend a couple of weeks, and we'll see what happens. And so what was really great is just the process of working with Bob is extraordinary. It's a mentorship in itself, but also there's a tremendous respect. And so we built the timeline, we built the set, I started to build the music. We're very close to finally having presenters and commissioners, and it's, I think the piece offers me as a composer a very fertile ground of cross-cultural study. So it's about, looking at the music of Cuba and looking at the influences of the Yoruba culture there and understanding, baseball statistics and Marlene Dietrich and all the things that might have been happening in Hemingway's life at the same time that he was writing Old Man and the Sea. So it's really about these parallel threads, Hemingway's life while he was writing it and Old Man and the Sea. And then it's like kind of explodes the form of opera. So it's written for a cellist, Jeffrey Ziegler, who's amazing, and then a set of 5 vocalists who are some classically trained and some improvisers. Then dancers, choir, and so should I play a little bit? Okay, so these videos are made, they're workshops, that just to be able to kind of, if you will, sell people onto the idea of what it might look like in the end, but it's very raw. So here you go.
Down to the ship set keeled breakers, forth on the godly sea, and we set up mast and sail on that swart ship, for sheep aboard.
One part, one part.
Bore us out onward with bellying canvas. Circe's this craft, the trim-kifed goddess. Then sat we amidships, wind jamming the tiller. Thus with stretched sail we went overseas.
So there's a lot to unpack here. I want to start first with that image, that flash, which looked like a ring, a boardwalk in a circular, format in a sea or at the beach. Was that the original idea of how this could play out as a performance?
So originally, it was supposed to be for the Commonwealth Games in Australia. And it had a whole commission, and it was supposed to be on a raft at sea, and that circle would connect the raft at sea to the beach. And then the audience was on the beach. And it was super exciting because Bob hadn't been actually doing site-specific work for a long time. And then that fell through. So then, but what was great about it, I mean, you know, these things happen, is that we kept that concept of the raft at sea. And also, there is a touch of poor man's theater, which is, you know, not a typical Wilson aesthetic. And I think there's something very interesting to the way the piece originated in terms of that commission and where it's going to end up. I think it's going to have a seed of that initial potential piece.
And then for those of you who have been, you know, at Watermill, I think every summer they have an open house. I would encourage everyone to try to see that. But what was that experience to be in that space and also work with Bob, who obviously has a very specific way of storytelling, storyboarding, the kind of range of references that are coming across. How is that interaction with you as the composer?
You know, he's extremely collaborative. I think that I mean, it was one of the most open experiences I've ever had. The first summer, we did not actually basically do any music. We actually sat around a table, and the goal for that summer was to have a timeline, and a timeline that would include all the references and all the, you know, the storyline. And so the actual libretto wasn't written until the next summer. And so it was wonderful. It was a lot about really finding, you know, the story within this that would be unique to Bob and unique to me, and it was an extraordinary process, very communal.
And then Helga Davis. Wow, I mean, stunning. I've met her on a couple of occasions and seen her perform many times now. You have a long relationship with her. Maybe tell us how that came about.
So for those of you that don't know Helga Davis, you should look her up. Helga was, I met her before this, but she became the lead character, one of the two lead characters in the remounting of Einstein on the Beach. I had the fortune of meeting her years before that and being so inspired by her that I wrote her an opera, and it was called Oceanic Verses. And in it was my first real foray into improvisation and what to do when you really bring improvisation into opera. She has a 4-octave range. She can sing anything. She's an actor. She's, you know, has the most extraordinary voice, but also soul. And we've been on a journey together now for a decade.
And one of my favorite instruments is the cello. And so, you know, we need to shout out Jeffrey Ziegler, who's in the room, who also happens to be your husband. So I'm going to take this opportunity to ask,
full disclosure.
You know, how is it to tell your husband what to do in that context?
There's no telling my husband what to do. Neither of us tell each other what to do. It's more a wonderful collaboration. And, you know, like, to be honest with you, any collaboration that becomes very close, there's friction. So there's just, in a way, we have to, you know, we have to go home together, so we have to figure it out much sooner. But it's the best for me as an artist to live with an artist, because there's a lot of sacrifice as an artist. So I don't think, perhaps somebody else might understand it, but it's a really nice thing to not have to explain what you do every day.
Well, bravo on that. And then maybe just 5 years in the making, some ups and downs, and so can you kind of tell us when we might finally be able to see this?
2020 to 2021 season. So in that season, it'll premiere either in, yes, I can't even say where, but yes, it's going to premiere.
Super. I want to segue a little bit into National Sawdust, but before we do that, you know, you have spoken with me as a friend that you had wished when you were coming up an incubator space like National Sawdust, but there weren't really those kind of systems in place, and that you know, being a female composer, there were many boundaries that you had to push through, and maybe just speak a little bit about what you did face trying to work through the New York City ecosystem of classical music.
Sure. Well, I mean, modern composition doesn't have a huge history of women in it. I mean, if you look at the Met Opera, they had their first woman composer last year. Their first woman composer.
Ooh, boo.
There, you know, I mean, this isn't just the Met Opera. I mean, I could name so many organizations. So it's really not, it's something that's endemic to the field, and I know other fields as well. My own challenge was the same as many of my contemporary colleagues who are women. Just there was not very much mentorship. And the idea of helping each other out wasn't really part of the dialogue while we were in school. So I was very fortunate to win one award, which is the only award I've won to date. It's called the Paul and Daisy Soros Fellowship. And it changed my life because it wasn't for music. It actually put me through school, and it allowed me to start my first nonprofit. And when I first got into the room, there were all these fellows who were thinking about sustainable economy and how they might change the world. And all of a sudden, my little problems became very little. And I realized that this approach to building my career needed to change, that in fact I needed to be worried about the context of my career and others, and that if I commissioned others and I commissioned myself, I could have the kind of career I wanted. And Paul Soros said to not just me, to our class of fellows, he said, if you have one piece of pie, don't divide it, make more. And that was a huge thing for me because it was like, of course, you know, we're all fighting for the same little scraps. They're not necessarily even the scraps I want. I mean, of course, we all want recognition, but, you know, it's not really what I want. What I want is a completely different career. And then began the very slow build. And, you know, the failures which force you to keep going and force you to keep reimagining.
The backstory of National Sawdust is so interesting. Maybe kind of walk us through Kevin Dolan's journey and how you met him.
So I met Kevin through Limor Tomer, who's an extraordinary curator at the Met Museum. And Limor had discovered me. She had I was one of the residents at the Whitney Museum when she was there. And Kevin had come to her, and I guess he had been through 20 other people to start the space. And when he finally asked Limor, she said, there's only one person, which was really nice of her. And she said, you have to meet Paola. And so Kevin, I was living at the time, half-time in San Francisco, because my husband was in the Kronos Quartet. And Kevin flew out to San Francisco to meet me. And I remember we sat down, and it was just the most humble and honest reason for why to start something, and it felt so right. I mean, he just said, you know, he's an attorney. It's actually very funny. I'll tell you this funny thing. He's a tax attorney, and when I first got introduced to him, I was like, oh man, I'm probably in trouble. I haven't done my taxes in years. Oh God, but that wasn't the reason. And it was the most humble reason to start something. He had found himself through composing at the age of 60 and had always been a musician, but really once he found composition, he discovered himself. And so he has 2 children who also loved music, and his basic premise was, I just want to start something that will help the younger folks out and make it a little easier. And at that time, I didn't think I would be fundraising. I thought he had raised all the money and I was going to come in and do the vision stuff. And I learned very quickly that that was not the case. Like anything in life, that was very naive of me. But he basically gave me carte blanche to create what I would have imagined to be the perfect space for young composers. And that I could have that kind of power in my 30s felt like the biggest gift I'd ever been given. Now, I had always imagined that I would have started a school, but when I was famous and like 60. So this was a little sooner, and balancing that and a career and family and my own desires and putting that in context was all of a sudden not kind of what I had imagined when I was 20. I thought it would be easier, but it's been a great gift. And then I went on to help him raise the remaining $8 million for the building.
And I guess what I love hearing about Kevin's story is, you know, his day job is tax attorney, but how passionate music is as part of his life. And then he also came upon an architect, a young, brilliant architect who helped manifest National Sawdust, which we'll show image in just a second. And his backstory is that he is also an opera singer.
Peter Zuspin of Bureau V, yes, an incredible partner in crime to me in those early years, because he really got what the space was meant to be. And the space here, let's look at it. So that's the outside of the space. It's a sawdust factory. So actually a funny story. So it was originally called, wait for this, it's terrible, Original Music Workshop. Try saying that like 3 times fast. And then it autocorrects on your phone to OMW, on my way. So every time I would try to say, I'm coming, I'm going to on my way. And eventually a friend of mine named Elena Park said, you're so silly, just call it National Sawdust, it's a great name. And it was called National Sawdust on the building, and we changed the name, and it's much better. We commissioned an incredible artist, Avaf, to do the outside. And there's Helga Davis right there. It's an homage to her. And what Peter did, which was so special, was that what Bureau V did was that they really wanted to create a space that composers and musicians of all styles and all kinds would want to write for. So the room itself has extraordinary acoustics. That's what the room looks like. And it's all suspended so that you can't hear anything going outside, and that it actually fits the value of the world's highest recording studio. It is completely transformable. We've done the most extraordinary theatrical pieces, operas, hip hop. I mean, all over the place. The ticket prices are low. It's got 12 residencies a year. It's a real dream space. And acoustically, it was designed by Arup, who Kevin likes to say were the only grown-ups on the cause.
And, and having an architecture background, I think just what is so exquisite about this piece in the New York City landscape is, we have a number of spaces where we can do very large-scale spectacle work with blue-chip names, and it's so utterly refreshing to have a more intimate space where you are working with young emerging artists and giving them their first platform, their first break, so that perhaps if they want to, they can graduate into these larger spaces. One of the ways we came in contact is the new museum has an incubator at the intersection of art, design, and technology. And to your credit, for some reason you saw some synergy, and you had reached out and said, ooh, I think we're going to collaborate at some point. And I was like, I don't know, okay. And you had this amazing film director who had come into your space when you were composing the Hubble Cantata. So maybe let's tell that story.
Sure. So first of all, I had admired, when we were doing case studies and of what already existed in New York and what niche we could fill, and also who we wanted to emulate, which is super important to do when you're building something because you don't want to repeat things. The new museum, specifically the incubator part, New Inc., had come up as a dream partner, but also something that we wanted to emulate in terms of, just more music specific. So I was composing this piece called the Hubble Cantata with the lead astrophysicist of the Hubble telescope to commemorate the telescope's 25th anniversary. And I wanted to do something very different visually, and I decided that I wanted to do VR. And so I came across this young filmmaker who's since then exploded, and she and I decided to create basically a VR experience that would take you through the Orion Nebula and give you the first experience. At the time, people weren't experiencing VR with the facility that you are now, because of course technology just evolves so quickly. But what we did in the end was we created a live spectacle in Prospect Park for 6,000 people, where they experienced the cantata with free VR in a surround sound setting, open air, and it was extraordinary. And Eliza developed it at the new museum. So we do partner with people a lot, and that was a wonderful example of where she might not have received as much just being in residence at Sawdust, whereas being at the new museum, all the contacts for VR were so important. The film went on to Cannes, to South by Southwest, and the piece went on to LA Opera. So I had a good life.
And I think, what's quite extraordinary about that is, VR is still in its kind of nascent phase. But you were really also one of the first to figure out how to use this technology in a communal space. And then beyond that, it's just so troublesome to put on the headset, and then you have to usually put on some earphones, and by that time you have 5 pounds on your head, and so again, your ability to understand VR as an experience with a live orchestra and creating that sound, and then all you had to do was kind of handle the Google Cardboards, I thought was amazing, and then finding Eliza McNitt, who is the film director, and her time at New Ink took her to her next phase, where she did the first VR film about the cosmos, and she premiered it at Sundance, and she is the first person to ever get a 7-figure deal on a VR film.
Working with Darren Aronofsky.
Right.
It's amazing.
And so, and a woman to boot. So that's very exciting. You have an amazing residency program.
Yes, it's a little long,
Yeah.
so you'll tell me, or I'll
Okay.
show a little bit,
Yeah,
and then I'll
let's show a
talk
little.
about it, but you'll let me know when to. This is Helga Davis. This is an extraordinary piece that she developed with us called Requiem for a Tuesday. And it was done in the round, and it was this extraordinary response to Black Lives Matter with Reggie Red Rock Gray, who actually did the gorgeous piece in the main space here called Flexin with Peter Sellers. And they were in residence before when we first opened.
And National Sawdust is this very special place. It's like a silence and chaos. And when I come here, the noise is gone, and I start to be able to see the essence of my own thought.
The work here is really intimate, and you get a chance to really feel the artist in the work.
And it takes me away from what can be so trivial and so distracting, and it makes me realize that that's why we're living. And I think that doing that with a community and with intimacy the way Sawdust can do is really valuable.
Sawdust gives space, time, and resources for projects that may not otherwise find a home.
Venues have been turning away hip-hop. And so for me to have a space to come to and say, hey, I want to rap my head off and really say something means a lot.
My residency in December, I can't think of another place in town that would have supported that in the way that that project was supported. It was a total blissful joy being here.
One thing that was really cool about that residency for me, and so this was a moment that allowed for a real cool overlap and fusion of people from LA and New York to come together and have a weekend of really rich programming.
What was shocking to me is that they asked me to do something, whatever I wanted to do. And so when we did Orphic Moments, it had a kind of energy, and in the room there was a feeling of something new.
So kind of share with us, how does someone get to be part of this residency? What's the application process like, and what are you looking for?
So the residency, we have 12 different residencies, and they're awarded to everything from composers to opera directors to groups in residence. Then we have curators, and then we have summer labs. And I say all these three because it's the way we program. So summer labs is where very emerging artists can come and receive support and time in the space, and it's really at the beginning of their careers. And Latasha, the rapper, actually came through Summer Labs, and we loved her so much that we gave her a full-on residency. The residency is where they actually receive funding, 17 hours of recording time, full mentorship, and all of our partner kind of experience. And that's actually done through our curation. What we learned is that not everybody will benefit from what Sawdust has to offer, in the sense that if someone's too advanced, then what we give is peanuts and it won't mean anything to them. Whereas for somebody much younger or who's at the right moment or needs a very specific type of mentorship, it will mean much more. Then we have curators, and they actually use their big names. So from everyone from Philip Glass to Laurie Anderson to Nico Muley, they use their big names to help discover artists that they're very passionate about. And then we get we get so many applications for the residency as well. So we have open calls, and there's 250 programs, so a lot of people get into National Sawdust. It's incredible the amount of talent that exists here.
And then, the residency is, quite frankly, just a small part of National Sawdust. I think what you saw there is also the diversity, the intergenerational, Philip Glass, Renee Fleming, who have all been incredibly generous to perform there and oftentimes as benefits. But, you guys are on, I think, 3 or 4 times a week. So times that by 52 weeks, it's a very, very dense program. And so how are you juggling all of that?
So the team at National Sawdust is extraordinary. It's many of them are artists. Many of them have been artists. It takes a very special type of person who wants to be part of a startup. Let's be frank, because startups nearly kill you. And the team is, the most hardworking team we've ever had. And they're very passionate about the cause. And so I think what we're doing, I never like when people say, what we're doing is so new or it's going to change the world. I don't think that. I just think that what we're doing is necessary. And so this idea of really taking an idea from the beginning phases all the way to the dissemination, meaning a record label, which is what we have. We have a criticism wing. This kind of nurturing, there will always be a need for it. And that's the whole point of Sawdust. I don't think it's going to go out of style because there's always going to be someone who needs that kind of arc.
So this is probably a good time to open it up. I'm sure there's folks here who would love to interrogate you some more. Do we have a mic to pass around? Great. And if you don't have any questions, I'm going to start talking about Beyonce and Kendrick Lamar.
Which I'd love to talk about, so shall we?
Let's talk about the Pulitzer Prize in Music.
Great.
Kendrick Lamar. What's your opinion, Paul?
So first of all, I think it's the best thing that ever happened. I think the Pulitzer has been going to the same group of very rarefied people for a long, long time. And if you look at the kind of arc of this change that has happened, it started with the 80s, where Ellen Tapes-Villich was the first woman to ever win the Pulitzer. Then you get into the 90s, and Wynton Marsalis won. Then you get to Henry Threadgill, and all these ideas of what consists of modern composition becomes really just what is great music. And so to me, Kendrick winning is, first of all, extremely important because he's an amazing artist. Then, extremely important because it allows us to really look at, how people are listening to music, how people are producing music. And then finally, extremely important because the only, to have a person of color win is very important. Modern composition is mostly white, and in the sense of who's winning, and that's not okay. So, this breaking down the boundaries and really creating equity in our field, it's just everybody has to be part of it. And so when I heard most of the people in my community just, sending this outcry, you sent me a great podcast about it, and it's the outcry that I understand is that many people were upset that someone who's so, established would win. Okay, so that's fair enough. I could see how that might be upsetting, but every other outcry really just it had a bad smell.
And when you were talking about your magician and the number of folks on stage, it was hard not for me, because if I recall, you had 100 musicians. And that's the exact number that apparently Beyonce had at Coachella. And I was lucky enough to be there a couple of weeks ago. I was at her second performance. And it kind of really goes back to where we started, about this idea of where music performance is going. And one has, one could look at it in a way where ultimately it's about business, because musicians are no longer making music or money via their labels, and everything is about being on tour. So the notion of how much effort is being put into performance has really elevated, I think, everybody's game. And would love to hear, did you catch any of the of Beyonce's online, or have you seen any of the videos, and what's your take?
So, a couple things. My take is that she's extraordinary, and that the performances are amazing, and they're huge spectacles, and they've, it's a very important, if you will, platform in terms of, not platform, it's a very important expression to have that kind of large theatrical expression. She's amazing. She's, I think, if you look at, for example, what John Zorn is doing in composition, obviously he has some things where he's completely in control of the material and some things where he's working with improvisers. I kind of think the same thing about Beyonce, what she's doing in terms of choosing the most extraordinary improvisers and collaborators and producing the producers makes what she's doing so extraordinary. And so I like to just think about how this exists in all these different styles. And to me, all that composition means is assembling sounds and organizing sounds. And so that's all it means. And I guess, your question is what I think about Beyonce. I have Lemonade on my phone, and I'm crazy about her. I didn't go to Coachella, and I've been a little busy lately, so I didn't see as much as I should have.
I think it's also, though, important to remember our forebears, and certainly I agree that Beyonce is amazing, but it does make me think about Harry Belafonte, who actually 6 years ago called out Jay-Z and Beyonce for perhaps not being socially active enough, given their hundreds of millions of people that they can influence. And it is extraordinary now to see that Jay-Z is talking about mass incarceration, or that's kind of the area where he's become an expert, and Beyonce creating an experience which really presents Black history to such a wide audience. And so I want to kind of flip it back to you as an artist, as and composer. You're hopefully just, not even midway through your career. What kind of legacy would you like to leave behind?
Well, before I take it to myself, I just want to say that one thing that really excites me about where music in terms of modern composition stands is that a lot more artists are actually thinking about the intersection of social justice and music. So, like, if you take, for example, Carnegie Hall, you think of it as like the most elite kind of, certain type of music. And Sarah Johnson, who's the head of education there, has basically brought social justice front and center to the hall. So I think a lot of artists, a lot of presenters are really understanding that in order to, there's been great moments in history where art has preceded social change, extraordinary moments. And in order for the arts to really be relevant as a fabric of society, artists need to keep thinking that way and need to take that responsibility. In terms of my own legacy, I think very much in the moment, in the sense that I'm doing exactly what I want to be doing. I just want National Sawdust to survive the beginning phase of how hard it is to build, and I want it to serve as many artists and to really bring equity to the field in terms of, really being a much more inclusive look at what the music community should be. And for myself, I hope that I can find the balance to keep writing and to, be able to wear these multiple hats that I wear with dignity, and that I can do it well.
Well, you've done brilliantly so far. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you
to TEFAF for this opportunity to share.